I can see him, but maybe he can't hear me.
Yeah, maybe he's getting that sorted still.
Yeah, okie dokie.
Yeah, same here in Manchester. Lovely day.
It's gorgeous. Absolutely beautiful here.
Yeah.
Forgotten that I was going to read my script off my computer and also try to Zoom at the same time. So I had to make some adjustments.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm forever needing adjusted.
Hi, David.
Ingrid, it's good to see you.
It's good to see you too. Long time.
Yes.
I hope you don't end up regretting seeing me today.
No, are you kidding me?
Wait a second. Let me do. Andrew's tangled up in some wires, so let me untangle him. Honey,
That's
here.
important. Hello, Stephen.
Okay, that's it.
Feeling awake still, David?
Pardon?
You feeling awake?
Oh, yes. Actually, I've got a big mug of coffee to keep me going in case Ingrid causes me to think rapturous thoughts about Amanda.
I hope that happens. I will join in with those thoughts.
They call her soporific Sarah.
Okay, is it time?
Okay. Well, if you're ready, then we can.
Yeah, I'm ready.
Okay. Well.
Can you hear, Andrew?
Yes.
I'll just introduce you very briefly, and then turn it over to you, and I'll help to facilitate questions at the end.
Okay.
So our speaker today is Ingrid Reneau Walls, and you are a Manchester Wesley Research Centre Visiting Research Fellow last summer, along with your husband Andrew Walls, and we didn't get a lot of time to talk because I was in New York, New Jersey most of that time. So I'm looking forward to learning more about your project that you've been working on. So the title is The Enchanted Universe of Amanda Berry Smith, a 19th century African American world Christian. Thank you, Ingrid.
Okay, thank you very much, Jordan, and thank you to everyone who has zoomed in for this talk. I thought what I would do today would be to begin with a preamble that covers some of my initial thoughts before I got into this paper, and then actually get into the paper itself. Why, during the Reconstruction era, does Amanda Berry Smith decide to join the camp meeting circuits instead of remaining within the folds of Black community and the AME Church to join in the nationalistic project of rebuilding and the healing of the race? Why did she not choose to join in racial uplift in the Talented Tenth, or join in solidarity with other Black women and their struggles to be ordained, and so on? Why did she choose to go further north and west into such ultra-white environments with her message of full salvation and the second blessing, the biblical blessing of Pentecost, when the disciples received more power to witness of the gospel of Jesus? Why seemingly choose white over Blacks? And why put herself in these environments where she was bound to be mistreated by whites? Well, the only thing I can think of is that she had been mistreated by Blacks too, in all Black environments within the AME Church. She had come to the assessment that, quote, some Black folks had the same nature as some whites, to be full of prejudice towards other Blacks because of difference in dress, in ideas, and in doctrine. It is as if she did not or would not perceive the more brutal destruction of the systems of slavery and Reconstruction overall on Blacks as more harmful and threatening to their destruction than interracial prejudice, colorization, and ostracization. But if that is the case, how did she come to think this way? Was it just her rural upbringing amongst kind whites? Or did she interpret her call to preach as an attendant mission to reach across the color line so that whites too would be truly saved and, moreover, would receive the kind of spiritual power that would radically transform their hearts into being what Howard Thurman calls the inward center, or a revolution in their perception of Blacks and of the ways in which they were treated individually, collectively, and institutionally. This paper is seeking to answer some of these questions that I've been putting to myself as I reread Amanda Berry Smith's autobiography. It is not an easy task introducing a 19th century African-American world Christian to this audience, especially one whose universe was enchanted. But Enchanted captures best the multi-dimensional realities of the 19th century United States, in which Amanda Berry Smith, a woman and of African-American ancestry, who was born a slave, created a life for herself as an internationally renowned holiness evangelist. On the one hand, there were the injustices of slavery, the brutality of the Civil War, and then the Reconstruction era of enforced segregation, lynchings, and disenfranchisement. And on the other, there was the Victorian era of the cult of true womanhood and domesticity, neither of which would have allowed her much freedom, much less an environment in which to create a life for herself. Yet she was also fortunate to have been born and to live a life during the 19th century era of Protestant evangelical camp meetings and the liberating religious, are you still hearing me?
Yes.
Okay, and the liberating religious and intercultural spaces that allowed in an otherwise disheartening and confining United States for poor people in general, and much more so for recently emancipated slaves. Smith creates a life of power for herself that was breathtakingly instructive and revealing. This she does following the footsteps of many foremothers of African ancestry, who had also combined their African Christian heritage with the religious milieu of their time to transcend the confines of gender, culture, and political structures. The word empowerment is more readily used when speaking about women who overcome myriad forms of sociopolitical oppressions and suppression and go on to develop a critical voice or a platform from which they challenge the status quo and engender various forms of social reform and revolutions. Certainly, this was the case in the lives of some outstanding women of African and American ancestry. But the degree of complexity and conflict internally and externally in their lives, marked by struggles and searches for a source or a vehicle of power through which to move through life with autonomy and authority, was steeped in enchantment. By enchantment, I mean the interplay between the pressures of the world they could see, the world that bore on their bodies physically and materially, and the embattled world they did not see, that they did see in the form of dreams, visions, scripture, the world of the spirit that bore on their minds and their souls internally and psychically. And this is what the influence of the US postbellum Methodist camp meetings made possible, and what the spiritual autobiographies of those like Amanda Berry Smith made hauntingly visible. Of course, we have heard of Sojourner Truth, one of the two most famous African-American women of the 19th century, whose narratives informed and influenced US history, the other being Harriet Tubman. The former because she became a famous abolitionist and feminist of the women's rights movement, most popularly known for the speech Aren't I a Woman, which we now know she had neither written or delivered, and the latter because of her role as the Moses of her people, leading many enslaved from U.S. southern plantations to freedom in northern states and Canada as the original conductor of the Underground Railroad. And there are many others of whom we may not have heard, who were also Amanda Berry's foremothers and contemporaries, most notably Jarena Lee Smith, Jarena Lee, African Methodist AME preacher, Julia Foote, Zilpha Elah, African American women of the African Methodist Episcopal denomination who pronounced themselves called to preach and were able to fulfill those callings via the evangelical camp meetings, and through this means went on to challenge the male-dominated leadership of the denominations, advocating always for change in women's leadership inside and outside of the church. While Lee and Smith shared the same denomination and position as evangelists, it was with truth that Smith appeared to have much more in common in the ways in which they rose to renown. The list of similarities are striking. Both were tall, dark-skinned women with striking presence and beautiful, powerful singing voices that, when combined with their preaching and talking, lifted people to transcendent heights. And both of their speaking style was steeped in African-American folk talk and humor. Both were born in slavery, but whilst Truth grew up in slavery until a young woman, Smith was freed whilst a child. As children, both lived in isolated farm areas in which there were few to no other slave communities, Truth in New York and Smith in Maryland. Because of this, both of them grew up in rural social environments where enslavers or farmers of European ancestry, with few slaves serving in mostly domestic settings, were their main source of community. But where Smith speaks continually of the, quote, kindness of those who were her enslavers, and later of those for whom she served as a domestic servant, she refers to herself as being in service. Truth lived with much physical and sexual abuse whilst a slave. They were both married, had children. In Smith's case, only one child, a daughter, survived. Truth had 4 children. Both of Smith's husbands died. The first, whom she married at 17, died during the Civil War, and the other died soon after she received the second blessing, and not too long after her third and favorite baby boy had died. Truth left her husband soon after her sanctification to fulfill her calling to preach. Strikingly, given the times in which they lived, they both maintained a public presence for more than 30 years. But unlike Truth, Smith was not only national and regional, she was also international. She traveled throughout Europe, spending months in England and Scotland, even attending Broadland's Conference of 1879 at the invitation of Lord Mounttemple. She spent time in Scotland, traveling into the Highland and in Ireland, and was even on the campus of the University of Edinburgh, visiting with the statue of John Knox. She was in Paris, Italy, Rome, Naples, Egypt, India, Burma, and in West Africa, in Sierra Leone, Liberia, Lagos, and Calabar. Ostensibly, she was an independently funded missionary during these travels, but Smith never did call herself a missionary. Even while serving in Africa, she made calls for missionaries to be sent to do the work needed there. Wherever she went, she functioned as she had done in the US, as an itinerant holiness evangelist, while Truth evolved into a formidable abolitionist, social reformer, and feminist activist. Ultimately, as freed slaves of an African religious ancestry, they were visionary women who used the public platform afforded to them through the Methodist second blessing to, quote, embrace responsibility in their roles as African-American, quote, priestesses in their community and of their era. For this paper, though, it is Smith's journey that will preoccupy us for a while. I will return to what I mean by embracing responsibility and being a priestess. Despite these numerous overt similarities in their lives, Truth is the one who has become a popular figure, as well as a symbol, according to the most recent biography of her life by historian Nell Irving Painter in the United States, while Smith has languished in obscurity. The first and only scholarly biography of her life thus far, entitled Amanda Berry Smith, From Washerwoman to Evangelist, was written in 1998, published in 1998 by Adrienne Israel and published by Langham. Israel introduces us to Smith in this way, and I will quote at length. While a rising tide of white supremacy and tightening grip of racial segregation plunged African Americans into the nadir of their history, this former slave and washerwoman steadily climbed toward the zenith of a long and colorful career that lasted nearly 50 years. Without official church sanction or financial support, she emerged from obscurity and near destitution to become one of the 19th century's most important Christian evangelists. Although nearly every African-American missionary had extended formal education, this woman, with less than a year of schooling, had worked with the pioneers of, yikes, sorry, something went amiss. Trying to get my paper back. Oh, okay, it's coming. This is on Andrew's computer. Okay, sorry. All right. Okay, here we go. I don't know why that disappeared like that. I hope it doesn't happen again. Okay. Okay, here we go. With less than a year of schooling, had worked with the pioneers of Methodist foreign missions, both in India, that would be with Bishop Thorben, who wrote the introduction to Smith's autobiography in 1893, and in Africa, this would be her work with Bishop Taylor, otherwise known as Bishop of Africa. Smith was the only female and only Black member of the Holiness Camp Meeting Association, a nationalist evangelist for the Women's Christian Temperance Union, a founding member of the Federation of Colored Women's Clubs, and lifelong member of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. She was renowned on 4 continents, bridged a widening gap between the races, and tapped the unfulfilled potential for cooperation across racial lines among evangelical Christians. Uncounted numbers of Africans, Asians, Europeans, and Americans accepted salvation and the second blessing of heart purity as an essential part of Christianity through her teaching and preaching. The first AME Deaconess Manual was based on her life. She helped stimulate the sanctified church movement among African Americans through her preaching and teaching, close quotes. Clearly, Smith was indeed a, quote, legend in her time, as Holiness Evangelical scholar David Bundy notes. And yet there has been little scholarly explorations of the life of this legend and what it was that made her such a uniquely subversive and yet deeply pious woman. The silence around Smith's work and life, not only within Christian and religious circles, but also within the African-American women's literary tradition, is deafening. It is not that she has not been mentioned in passing. Her name has been included in most discussions of both traditions, but further explorations of her life have been few. Indeed, it was not until 1988 that the Schoenberg edition of her autobiography was included in its 19th century collection of African. Oh, there's some weird thing going on. I'm sorry, I've lost my paper again. This is horrible. I don't know why this is happening to me. Sorry.
Okay. Right.
Oh, bumblebee tuna. That's my curse word. Hi, Andrew, I've lost my paper and I don't know how to get it back. I have it on my iPad, so I'll see if I can get it on there. Oof. And see if we could stay on this one. Okay, here we are. It is not that she has not been mentioned in passing. Her name has been included in most discussions of both traditions, but further explorations of her life have been few. Indeed, it was not until 1988 that the Schoenberg edition of her autobiography was included in its 19th century collection of African-American women's narratives. These absences have both frustrated and piqued my curiosity, drawing me more inquiringly towards Smith's presence conveyed in the recreated universe her words articulated. the universe that she had inhabited and that inhabited her. The power of her personality expressed literarily, and the very sound of her voice seemed to reach across time and space with much wisdom and insight. This Bishop Thorben convincingly captures in his introduction to her autobiography when he wrote, quote, "When I chanced to be kneeling near her at a prayer meeting, I became impressed that she was a person of more than ordinary power. Whilst witnessing her kneeling and singing, he notes that something like a halo glow seemed to rest upon her dark face before me, and I felt in a second that she was possessed of a rare degree of spiritual power." He notes further that during her stay in Calcutta, she had opportunities for seeing a good deal of native community. Here again, he writes, "I was struck with her extraordinary power of discernment. This penetrating power of discernment, which she possesses in so large a degree, impressed me more and more the longer I knew her." Close quotes. I will return later to Tobin's assessment of Smith's powers, for in referring to them, as he does, he directs our attention to three aspects of Smith's enchanted universe: the role of the spirit of prayer, the role of prophetic improvisational singing within worship, which African-American musicologist John Michael Spencer calls the basis for anti-structure in Black worship and style hymnody, and her powers of discernment, which are informed by her African-derived religious heritage, as well as the Protestant second blessing and her life as a slave. My most compelling reason, though, for being drawn to Smith's narrative was because at the time I had first encountered her work, I was interested in what Pentecostals called, quote, the baptism of the Holy Spirit. And what I had read in Smith seemed to be the same thing, now being called by a new name, sort of what had happened in truth time, the use of perfectionism then, and second blessing in Smith's time, or what Wesley had called full salvation, and which many Pentecostals in my lifetime had tried in vain to convince me that I was still in need of, even though I knew I was and had been converted for once and forever. But I was severely persuaded to forget about her after having written about her for my first graduate school paper, because as the professor had queried at the time, "Well, Ingrid, who will read this? Who is interested in her? And where do you think you will ever get something like this published?" Still, over many years and generations, Smith's voice and words have the power to resonate clearly from the distant past into the now, especially in her views on missionaries serving in Africa. There are passages that reminded me of queries I began to formulate during my initial entry into the world of international Christian missions, whilst coming from the secular worlds of corporate banking and academia to serve with the Presbyterian Church in South Sudan. During her 8 years in Liberia, Smith captures what an imaginary query to her would be like, based on her observations as a woman of African ancestry, assessing the work of missionaries serving in Africa. She writes, and I quote, "Then you think, Mrs. Smith, is it better that white missionaries should go to Africa? Yes, if they are the right kind, if they are thoroughly converted and fully consecrated and wholly sanctified to God, so that all their prejudices are completely killed out and their hearts are full of love and sympathy, and they have firmness of character and good, broad, level-headed common sense, and are possessed of great patience and strong, persistent, persevering faith, and then keep up the spirit of earnest prayer to the Almighty day and night. I do not say that it is necessary to be under a dead strain all the time, not at all. But my own personal experience is that the more one prays and trusts in God, the better he can get on, especially in Africa. Everything is so different from what you have at home that this is an absolute necessity. And the person that has not got the stick-to-itiveness on these lines, especially, whatever else he may have, will not make a good missionary in Africa, whether he be white or Black. Can anyone argue against what she had to say? Her insight, her wit, and tone of voice are strikingly ordinary and folksy sounding, but full of a timeless spirit of truth. It seemed fitting to let Smith's words on missionaries lead us into her enchanted life, for in them we catch a glimpse of some key concepts in Smith's vision of how she created the world she inhabited. When we combine some key elements from this quotation with others of Bishop Thorbin's and Israel's, we can name some key aspects of her vision and the ways in which she constructed and inhabited a universe in which she could be as liberated as possible, given the socio-political realities of her time. For Smith, the second blessing was not only about holiness in some otherworldly sense of do's and don't. It was moreover about possessing and exercising with courageous authority an emboldening common sense that empowered her to cross over and over again what Du Bois called the color line, and in her case, the class line. Racial segregation and class prejudice on a social person-to-person basis could be overcome via both holiness as purity of heart and by a holy common sense as that which enabled the person of any ancestry to go anywhere and enter into any socio-political space and to act decently in accordance with expectations of what it meant to be a basic human being. As Smith uses it, common sense was not common during her time because it was predicated on behaving humanely and, more importantly, kindly across the color line. Being truthful and fearless in articulating her insights into human nature, be they of people of European or African ancestry, even when it meant appearing as what she realized she was being called, the white man's nigger, close quotes, was vital to her personal mission of, quote, embracing the responsibility of crossing the color line. I am borrowing this term of embracing responsibility from literary critic Judalyn Ryan, who explores other 19th century African-American preachers and political speakers as priestesses. She claims these priestesses are those who exercise righteous, creative agency by mediating between cultural and spiritual community, its oppressors and divinities or ancestors. They consciously present themselves, their vision, their knowledge, their memory, and work as offerings designed to strengthen the life force of the community, close quote. In Smith's case, the community extended to the broader society and to the world, whether socially constructed or religiously, was made of Blacks and as well as whites. Strikingly, whilst Ryan does mention Smith as a 19th century woman evangelist, she does not include her in her in-depth analysis. Instead, she focuses on Maria Stewart, the first American and African-American political speaker. Smith, though, functions in a similar vein, albeit more assertively through the religious as opposed to the political arena. From the above quote of Smith, the long one on missionaries, we can also see that being able to love and being kind or of a decent character were central to Smith's vision. Kind or kindness are words littered throughout her autobiography, and they mean much more than one would think. For kindness was predicated not on who one was culturally, or in terms of class, or belonging, or exclusion, but rather kindness was fundamentally having to do with who one was in the expression of self as a human being. It was the starting point of the character of being human in a world in which most people would and did treat her unkindly, which is to put it mildly, because of her skin color. Her focus on mutual love and kindness across the color line, despite the racial hatred, rampant discrimination and injustices, had everything to do with the healing and liberating power of the religion of Jesus that she embraced, not merely for what it would enable her to do for others, but much more importantly, for what it would enable her to do for herself and for how she would choose to live her life. And here again, I am borrowing this time from the scholar and modern mystic Harriet Tubman, who in his very little book titled Jesus and the Disinherited, discusses at length, quote, the meaning of religion, of Christianity to the man and woman, especially in this case, who stands with his back against the wall, close quote. Thurman asserts, the masses of men and women live with their backs constantly against the wall. They are the poor, the disinherited, and the dispossessed. What does our religion offer them? The issue is not what it counsels them to do for others, whose needs may be greater, but what religion offers to meet their needs. The search for an answer to this question is perhaps the most important religious quest of modern life. In answering the imaginary question posed to her in the way she does in the quote I referred to earlier, Smith describes the characteristics of the right kind of missionary. And in doing so, she's pretty much describing the ways in which she lived her life, both before and after conversion. She's presenting the character of the life of a missionary, not so much in what she does via religion to help others, but the ways in which that religion helps her as one of the masses of the poor, disinherited, and dispossessed to create a life of decency, a life of responsibility, and a life of exercising agency. Moreover, her emphasis on a character of love, of being fearless and being truthful, conforms to Thurman's analysis of the ultimate difference that the religion of Jesus makes in the life of the disinherited, which is to overcome the three hounds of hell, fear, hypocrisy, and hatred that track the trail of the disinherited and that need have no dominion over them once the Spirit of Jesus takes up residence within. Thurman refers to that within as the quote unquote inward center of the human being, where the kingdom of God lies and is the heartland of the life force that enables such impossible transformation. It is the power of Smith's inward center that we witness again and again throughout her autobiography. And in doing so, we see the ways in which she circumvents the sociopolitical structures of her times, both externally and internally within her own denomination, to represent herself and her advocacy for others to do likewise, be they of African or of European descent. Thirdly, and still drawing from that quote, we witness from that and throughout her narrative the method in which she appropriates the sphere of the divine in her inward center, as well as the ways in which she would have everyone else do likewise, missionaries especially. It is by prayers or God talk as a way of exercising authority over one's life situations. It was her way of engaging the presence of God and of the evil one too, a way of maintaining an ongoing conversation and interaction between the seen and unseen worlds. Significantly, prayers, as well as visions and dreams, singing hymns, spirituals, and gospel songs, were the radical root and the core of her existence. They were her legacy, passed intergenerationally from her grandmother and her mother. Smith's 500-page spiritual autobiography begins, as many others do, with locations and descriptions of birth, family relationships, and in this case, how she came to be free prior to emancipation. It is in the early stages of her text that we encounter what will become central to her life and ministry. And the way she represents these early scenes reminded me of Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, especially her depiction of the dying scene of her mother's young mistress, who was from a staunch Presbyterian family and departs life soon after being converted at a local Methodist camp meeting. But before doing so, she makes her dying wish the freedom of Smith's parents and all their children. Here, though, in Smith's representation of the sometimes inevitably intimate relationships between the enslaved and their enslavers, Smith reveals the back life or the hidden inner life of the enslaved. And in doing so, she rewrites and she represents Beecher Stowe's representation of the enslaved as those whose lives were without some form of agency. And thus they were depicted as complete victims who were slaves twice over, once to the plantation economy system and then again to the religious system of plantation Christianity. Smith describes the dying scene of her mother's young owner in this way, and I must quote at length. The young owner says to her parents, "I have one request I want to make." They said, "Anything, my dear. I want you to promise me that you will let Samuel," which is Smith's father, "have Mariam," Smith's mother, and the children. Then they had my mother get up off bed at once. Of course, they did not want her to hear that. When they said this, and they sent my mother out, she ran with all her might and told grandmother. And grandmother's faith saw the door open for the freedom of her children. And she ran out into the bush and told Jesus. Of course, my mother had to hurry back so as not to be missed in the house. Miss Seeley went on that way for 3 days. When the second day came and she made the request, they sent my mother out. She ran and told grandmother that Miss had made the same request. Then she ran back to the house again. And my grandmother went out to the bush and told Jesus. At last, it came to the third and last day. My mother was in the bed behind Miss Seeley, holding her up. "I want you to make one promise. That is, that you will let Samuel and Marian and the children go." "Oh, yes, my dear," they said. "We will do anything." My mother was a great singer. When Miss Seeley got the promise, leaning her head upon my mother's breast, she said, "Now, Mary, sing." Here we witness Smith's grandmother's faith, which opened the door of freedom for her children and her grandchildren. Upon hearing her daughter and children would be free, Smith's grandmother ran and told Jesus. Where? She ran to the bush. For enslaved Africans and their descendants, the bush was that space away from the enslavers' gates where they could and did worship God in their own way. It was the hallowed environment in the dark where they prayed, shouted, and met God for themselves, unmediated by any other source. This wilderness, to use a Dolores Williams term, migrated from the rural landscape of the plantation into Smith's urban campground and international landscape. It's while she is in prayer at the camp meeting and in the wilderness, she creates in the campground that Thorben senses her power in the spirit. And as her mother and grandmother had done before her, it was in singing also that Smith's power in the spirit was made visible. This too, Thorben realizes as he watches her at the camp meeting where he first met her. Later in Calcutta, when she establishes the wilderness in the midst of being threatened by a mob of anti-Christians, she drops to the ground in prayer and does so with such power, it stills and cancels the oncoming violence that was about to be rained upon her and others. These wilderness prayers, if you will, combined with her insistent singing of hymns and spirituals throughout her text, renders the text in full anti-structure, which is to say, she recasts her entire autobiography into the improvisational worship style of African-American religiosity. This is a religiosity that could and did readily embrace the liberating wilderness of Protestant campground meetings. Moreover, from within such a religiosity, Smith could continue and did always use the self-authority she had gleaned from the improvisational nature of her African-derived religiosity to embody the additional strain of the power of second blessing. With the second blessing, on the foundation of her African-American religiosity, she authorizes herself and maintains a life of legendary, daring, misunderstood, visionary leadership that made her an exotic, yes, to some, but nevertheless an unstoppable force and visible agent of transformation and transcendence at a time when this was not supposed to be possible for too many people, certainly not for women, much less for a tall, dark-skinned one. And I think I should stop here, shouldn't I, in terms of time?
Yeah, you could go on for a few more minutes if you want, or we can stop. It's up to you.
Well,
We've got about an hour, so we've got 25 minutes or so, 20 minutes.
How many minutes do you usually have for question and answers?
Usually 15, 20 minutes. So you can go on for 5 more minutes if you want, or you can stop for questions, whatever you prefer.
Well, I could read a little bit more.
Okay.
Well, I mean,
Yes.
if anybody wants to hear more, you might want to just jump into the question and answers.
Yeah. Why don't you go ahead until you feel like you're at a good stopping point?
There is no good stopping point.
Right. Okay. Or whatever you most want to say in 5 minutes.
Okay. Of course, there was much more needed than common sense to eradicate segregation systematically, and with the hurts of humanity. Laws had to be enacted, and still, even today, most churches in the USA are segregated, and certainly that is the case in the education system. Still, what Smith is advocating here is the need for human interaction that challenges, that crosses the color line, simply because it is something that must be done. And it must be done by somebody whose life has prepared them to have the courage and the cultural liberty to do so. In this way, Smith reminds me of a tale I was told of someone whom was called by Bishop Desmond Tutu to, quote, "Come on and let us go break the law together." Meaning, let us go and hang out together in Soweto, the African townships, where Europeans were not supposed to stay. This is what Smith was essentially doing by herself via the authorizing agency of the second blessing. She did this over and over again, and the camp meeting settings made this possible. For a woman who spent her entire life in service to people of European ancestry, and who, as one of the masses of the dispossessed, whiteness is naturally an equally oppressive aspect of Smith's life. Her religion had to, in some way, afford her a way to alleviate that oppression, and it does. Moreover, through her visions, Smith signals what will become her life's work. She will pick up the heavy white cross of working and living across the color line. Her entire life had prepared her for doing so. Hence her constant reference to kindness she received at the hands of innumerable white people wherever and whenever she received it. It was not just that she wanted to be treated kindly, but that she took kindness as a marker of basic humanity in both people of African and European ancestry. And with sanctification came the final, visibly external authorization to embrace the responsibility that she had received in a vision. Because more kindness was needed in all humans, whites and blacks, Smith took among herself through her religion to become the channel through whom much kindness would flow from others, from her and to others, and so on and so on. So I feel like I'm breaking apart here a bit, so I think I'll stop, if that's okay. And then if people have any questions, I can go back and address some other issues. So I think I will stop here, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ingrid. So we've got 15 minutes or so for questions and discussion. So anyone feel free to jump in. Those of you who've muted your microphones while Ingrid was speaking, remember to unmute them if you want to ask a question. Anyone want to start with a question?
Hi, everybody. Hi, Ingrid.
Oh, hello there. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm fine. Good to see you.
You too.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, so what would you say, what was Amanda Berry Smith's definition of sanctification? How would she define the second work of grace? Would it be the same as the church over time, or would you think that the definition would be different?
I don't think that the definition would be different, because I think her definition of sanctification would be an experience of the authority and the power of the Holy Spirit coming into and upon her life. And I think that's the same as what is expressed in the scriptures. It's the same as what I have read from Sojourner Truth. It's the same that I have read from other people. It is an actual experience. It's something that that nobody can take away from you. It's something that nobody can say, no, that didn't really happen. And what she does so well in her autobiography is she chronicles the journey to actually receiving that sanctification. The prayers she prays, the doubts, the going back, the constantly seeking through the scriptures, and then finally through her meeting with John Inskip. And then chronicling the gradual increasing sense of that power in her mind, in her spirit, in her body. I mean, she does that very, very well. And I was very aware that I wasn't covering that in this paper. I mean, it would be in the longer version, but she makes it very, very visual, very, very vivid. And I can relate to it. I can totally relate to it as a person who also believes in the baptism of the Holy Spirit or the second blessing. I can relate to that experience, to that concretely, that experience of feeling the power of the Holy Spirit. And I had to, because I was going to work in South Sudan in some of the areas that people would only see through National Geographic. And I was very conscious of the need for more power in those situations. And so, yeah, I would say it hasn't changed. It's the same definition, whether it's Sojourner Truth's definition, whether it's Harriet Tubman's, and going right back to the actual experience of Pentecost.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Ingrid, one of the things I was wondering about, would be interesting to hear a little bit more about, is her relationship with the African Methodist Episcopal Church. What was her relationship with the leadership of the church? How did she interact with them, and how did they respond to her itinerant ministry?
Right. Well, it was a very conflicted relationship, naturally, because she is a woman, and at first she really tries to enter into the middle class, the Black middle class. And I think initially it seems to me that she had envisioned that happening via her husband, that he would become a pastor, and she, as a pastor's wife, would be able to create a life, a very decent middle class life. And while she is a washerwoman and trying to acquire that life, her husband dies, and she begins to critique the life that she was seeking to enter. And she's very clear about the colorizations within the African American Episcopal Church. She's very clear about the stratification within the church and within the Black middle class, the very early Black middle class. She's very clear about it, and she critiques it. She's ostracized because she dresses differently. And not only does she dress like one of the friends, but she begins to talk to people and to tell them that she's been sanctified. And they know that that means now that she feels that she has something that they do not have. Not only do they not have it, but they need to have it if they will actually be the best, true, powerful, kind Christians that they can be. So it's very conflicted. And she's constantly making comments about the inadequacies and the insufficiencies of the doctrines within the church itself. So eventually, of course, I mean, she is relegated to this sort of on the margins positions. And it's not until she is recognized at one of the conventions, and she goes there again by faith, and she is called up front by the Jubilee singers, and she leads them in singing. And in doing that sort of opened a door for people within the AME, especially the ones who are seeking to be a part of that talent intent and to maintain that sort of elite position. They finally look at her and say, oh yeah, right, Mrs. Smith, she's somebody after all. And but she doesn't accept it. She doesn't sort of yield to it. She's aware that women are struggling to be ordained and to obtain that kind of recognition within the church. She doesn't partake. She's very clear about, well, that's not my calling, that's not my mission. And I think it took a great deal of courage to do that. It had to. It was an impossible thing to do. This is not my path. My path is over here. God is telling me to go. And where is he telling me to go? To Oakfield, New Jersey, where there are not too many Black people. So she knows that her path is different. She is being criticized for what she's doing, but she's doing it anyway. And she's also criticizing them at the same time for the hypocrisies and the levels of duplicity within the church itself. So it's conflicted. She's a part of them, but she's not. And she's going to go her own. She's going to go on her own path, no matter what is said and what is done. And of course, that is why to this day she's still on the margins, because I think she's suspect. Was she really for us, with us? What was her real story, you see? So that's how I would interpret it.
Thanks.
You in the quotation from Adrian Israel, she mentioned the WCTU.
Yes.
I'm curious if I know that was beyond the scope of your paper in some ways, but on other hands, I'm intrigued if you could summarize her relationship with that organization in light of your analysis.
Well, what I find really striking about Amanda Berry's many different affiliations, I don't really think any of her affiliations and relationships were not conflicted.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So even with these women, it was very conflicted, and she was very aware. I think a lot of people sort of talk about her as if though she had little to no awareness of the ways in which she was being treated and mistreated by whites. Mm-hmm. I think she was very, very conscious. So she's invited by them to give a talk in Liverpool, and they knew that she wanted to go to Broadlands. And she had been invited to go to Broadlands, and they did their best to dissuade her from going to Broadlands. But what she always did was she always went to her wilderness. She would pray, and then she would come back and say, I can't do what you're asking me to do because God has told me that I am supposed to go to Broadlands. So they said, okay, you're going to do what you want to do, but that's not what we want you to do. We have invited you to come to Liverpool. So what they did is they went ahead and they made these great big posters to say, okay, the evangelist, Amanda Berry Smith is coming, and so on and so forth. And eventually they steered her, sort of manipulated her into going to the temperance meeting instead of Broadlands. So that's why she went to Broadlands a year later. Mm-hmm. And so she arrives there, she sees what they have done. It is very clear she's not pleased, but what is she going to do? It's not as if though she's going to say, well, I'm not going to speak. I don't like what you're doing. I resent it. She doesn't do that. You know, she goes ahead and she speaks. Her speaking is well received. She goes on and she speaks from there, but she's aware of how she's being framed, how she's being depicted, and the fact that her liberty is constrained through these relationships with these Christian temperance women. Of course, eventually she incorporates that doctrine into her own teachings, so that when she's in Liberia and she sees the extent to which people are drinking, then she begins to make Christian temperance a huge part of her own ministry and her own mission, right? But in terms of those initial relationships, they were very conflicted, right? David, you're smiling.
I am, because I'm happy with what you're doing.
Well, if there are questions, any comments?
Another question that I have is, who funded her international travel?
everybody. A lot of the Christian temperance women, a lot of the women that she met through Phoebe Palmer's house meetings, everywhere she went, she struck up these friendships with these women and men who were, I think, were impressed, really, is the only way I can say. Well, we can't believe that this is a Negro from America who is doing this. This is not supposed to happen. I mean, that's the backstory that you're always picking up from what's happening. And so, okay, so we will fund this. So everything that she initially wants to do, eventually people come on board to fund, because I think she's such an anomaly. They just don't expect this to be. This is not supposed to be. But then when she speaks and when she shares, the power, the spiritual presence and power convinces and convicts people. And I think they then want to get on board and support her as much as they can. So she was never without support, absolutely never. And a lot of the people who ended up supporting her were people who were converted and also received the second blessing. So they were even more convinced that what she was doing was genuine and that it was needed. I mean, the person who provided her home in the latter part of her life was somebody whom she met at a camp meeting, who was converted and then received the second blessing, and then also became an advocate himself. And he was wealthy, very, very wealthy. So she had no fear about entering into many different social spheres and being herself. And in being herself, winning people over, because they didn't expect this to be so. So initially, that's how I would answer that question.
I think a really interesting case of her power was the comments of reflected in the comments of James Rendell Harris about her entrance in as a tourist into King's College Chapel in
Absolutely.
Cambridge.
Absolutely. And also Cadbury
Yes,
in his introduction to an abbreviation of her. I mean, they're astounded. They can't believe it.
Yeah.
Right.
Few more minutes.
The brush arbor tradition is really important for all of the holiness movements in the United States.
Sorry?
The brush arbor tradition is important for all of the holiness movements in the United States during the 19th century.
Mm-hmm.
And this running into the woods to talk to Jesus
Mm-hmm.
is something that comes from the African American communities into the larger holiness movements and becomes a standard part of their rhetoric and literature.
Oh, great. I should have read that and been able to cite that in my paper. I just knew I knew when I saw the reference in her autobiography.
Yeah,
and I didn't remember seeing them quite clearly when I had read them in graduate school, but then I knew that pattern came from African traditions. I also knew so much of what she did, how she entered into that depth of spirit space was from her African tradition. So, yeah.
That's
Right.
a really fascinating part of that transfer of ways of thinking from African American communities to the larger white communities and Asian communities.
But did they realize of the transfer?
I think so. There's an interesting book by I get his name, George Jackson.
Yes.
Entitled White Spirituals and Southern something. I'm forgetting it, but he was one of the first people to start to trace this out.
Right.
It's an older book, but it's still really, really helpful.
Okay, I'll definitely look at it. as soon as I can get into the library.
Yes, that's a problem for us all, I'm sorry to say.
Well, yeah, that was sort of a real hang up, because I realized I am hung up because I can't get to the library, and I just had recently gotten my my Scunal access to
Yes.
for Aberdeen Library, and then we're in lockdown. So I thought, okay, well, I'll just have to go with what I've got, and David Monday will be there, and I'm quite sure he's gonna make a reference or two that I will find very useful. So thank you very much, David. I'm grateful to you.
Okay, I think we're towards the end of our time. If there's anyone waiting to ask a question, feel free to ask.
Or may I say, if it doesn't come now, you could always email me with your comment or question. I'd be most grateful to receive it.
Sure.
Yeah.
And yeah, if you don't have Ingrid's email, just let me know and I'll pass it on.
Okay.
But we look forward, Ingrid, to seeing how this develops and hopefully reading it in publication in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Look forward to being back with you and Andrew next week when Andrew presents to us.
That's right. He's been preparing, because sometimes he's not always able to read. So he's preparing and getting it in his head. If in case he can't read, he can just speak it.
Okay, very good.
Yeah.
Well, give him our warm greetings.
Yeah. He's right here. I don't know if you can see him.
No, I can't see him, but I kind of sensed his spirit there.
Yeah. He's right here. Sorry you don't see him. Thank you all for coming and for listening. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you all who participated.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. I need to leave the meeting. It's right here. Yeah.